from the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture.
Good morning. It is June 29th, 2016. This is David Klein of the History Department at Virginia Tech and also working with the Southern Oral History Program at UNC in Chapel Hill. This morning we are recording for the Civil Rights History Project, and we're in San Diego, California. This project is sponsored by the Library of Congress and also the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. Behind the camera today, we have John Bishop of Media Generation and UCLA. We're also joined behind the camera by Guha Shankar of the Library of Congress and Jessica Jollett of Pillars of the Community, which is a local organization we'll hear a little bit more about here in San Diego. So we are incredibly honored to be able to spend some time this morning with Roberta Alexander. This is the one time I'll coach you at all in our entire conversation, but if you could introduce yourself with a full sentence, I am, or my name is, and your name and where and when you were born, and then we'll talk.
Oh, I'm Roberta Alexander, and I was born in December 1946 in Berkeley, California.
Okay, great. So Roberta, I'd love to start with you telling us a little bit about your family background and how that may have influenced you as you grew up.
My family background definitely influenced me and my brother and sister very, very much. My grandfather was a slave. And that seems hard to imagine if you try to do the math, but he was born in 1842 and he died in 1942. And the article that was written about him in an Omaha newspaper wrote about his having been a slave, and my father had known he had been a slave, and also wrote about him having participated in the Pony Express. My father grew up between the Omaha Indian Reservation and Sioux City, Iowa. So most of his life, his younger life, he identified as not a member of the tribe, because he knew he wasn't a member of a tribe, but all of his friends were kids from the reservation or the kids in Sioux City, Iowa, who were like the children of packing house workers, because his mother would go there to work in the packing houses at that time.
How did he come to be associated with the reservation?
Because of his father. His father actually my grandfather spoke Winnebago, Omaha, and Sioux. And according to my dad, Sioux and Omaha are closely related languages, and Winnebago is more different. And according to family lore, he got this job on the Pony Express, which would not have lasted very long because the Pony Express was only in existence for about a year and a half. But because he could speak the Indian languages and could go through some areas where other people couldn't go. And he did it on the condition that he would tell the white people nothing about what the Indians were doing.
So they ended up living there.
So, yes. So they ended up living there, but it was mostly my grandmother who was home. My grandfather did lots of different things. He was an itinerant musician, actually, and he played the Jew's harp, and he traveled with a guy named Giles who played the 12-string guitar. He also was a bootlegger for a period of time. He also rustled cattle and sold cattle. So he was not home very often, but he did manage to have 10 children. And my grandmother was a little Scot-Irish lady who ended up living mostly on the reservation.
Amazing family background.
Right.
And then your own father and his siblings.
So my father was born in 1914. So if you do the math, his father was pretty old when he was born. My father had 9 siblings, 5 girls and 5 boys. And 3 of the girls died of different things. One of the flu pandemic, another of tuberculosis, and the third one in a fire. When they were home, because they were often home alone, when she was working in the packing houses in Sioux City, Iowa, and I think she was ironing or something, and there was a fire, and so she died in that.
Okay. And did he stay, your father, in that area?
Well, that's an interesting question because, no, in the end he came to California. But growing up, he at one point, we did an oral history with my dad, and at one point he said, home, what was home? We were always staying with different people. So if you think about it, his mother also died fairly early because she had tuberculosis. She died when he was 15. But growing up, he was sometimes in Sioux City, Iowa with his mother. He was sometimes on the reservation with his mother. At other times, he was with his brother, Earl Alexander. And at another time, he was in Flint, Michigan with another brother, Mark Alexander, who worked in the automobile plants and was very religious. And my father sort of ran away from there, but he worked as a bellhop in Flint, Michigan. So between the years of 10 and 15, he must have lived in 10 or 15 different places and done just as many jobs. There's one in particular that I would like to tell you about. When he was about 12, he decided to work, to ride the rails and get work in the harvest in Minnesota. And when we had the reunion for our family on the reservation, we could see that the rail lines go right through the reservation. It would have been easy for him to hop on. So he did. At 12, 13 years old, he goes to Minnesota riding the rails. He gets off someplace and he asks around, does anybody need any help doing the harvest? So he finds this farmer and the guy says, yeah, I need some help. And this is where I live, and come out at 6 o'clock or something like that, and I'll get you set up. And he gave my dad some money to buy some food, but he didn't give him any money to get out to the farm, and the farm was about 5 miles out. Or he didn't offer him a ride, I should say. And my dad gets out there, and the farmer is doing chores, so my dad helps him do the chores with the different animals, the chickens, and milking all the cows and everything. Then he goes into the bunkhouse, and the farmer's wife brings him food. He always talks about food because that was really important, because he said he was hungry 99% of the time. So he says, she brought me sandwiches and some milk, and I thought, oh, this is cool. And the farmer offered to pay me 50 cents a day, and that's terrific. So he notices that in the bunkhouse there's a bunch of all grown men, and they're all white, of course. So anyway, one of them comes up to him and they say, so what are you doing here, coon? Or some kind of, derogatory term. Or really my dad would say he didn't know what that meant at that stage. And he says, well, I'm here to work the harvest. And the guy says, really, you're here to work the harvest? He says, yeah. He says, what's he paying you? 50 cents a day? And the guy says, 50 cents a day and you're doing chores on top of it? And he says, yeah, because he's so proud of himself. And the guy says to him, they're Scandinavian, by the way. My father say they're Swedes and Norwegians and so forth. And the guy says, you can't work for 50 cents a day. You're a worker just like we are. You have to get $1 a day just like we do. Then my dad says, oh, this is terrific, But he's kind of nervous because the guy was calling him a shine and a coon and all of these things. So next morning at breakfast, and my dad explains the breakfast: sausage, biscuits, gravy, pancakes, bacon, eggs. And he says in the middle of all of this feast, this guy stands up and tells the farmer, we understand you're hiring this boy for 50 cents a day. And the farmer says, that's right. And he says, no, you can't do that. Either you fire him or you give him $1 a day. And then the guy says, well, I don't know what to do. He says, no, actually, you give him $1 a day or we strike. And my dad's going, strike? He's going to strike? I barely finished my breakfast because he knew what a strike was. He had lived in Sioux City, Iowa with his mother in the late teens and in the early 20s, and there were strikes at the packing house. And he would describe all of the people who were on strike. And it was amazing because he listed Mexicans, Syrians, and Poles and Russians, as well as a few black folks and a few Indians. And at that time, there was a real campaign of terror against the strikers. So, for example, my dad would never sit at night in front of a window that was not covered. Ku Klux Klan would march down the street, and he felt they targeted his mom, but then because she had these black kids, but then he said, no, they targeted everybody, and they would throw rocks in the windows and terrorize folks. So back to the breakfast, he says, strike, we can't go on strike. I have barely finished my breakfast. And the guy says, nope, we're going to do this. So the owner says, well, okay, but he's got to carry his weight. So my dad starts working with him, and he's running as fast as he can. And it was what they called shocking grain. So the grain would be cut, and then they would pick it up and tie it up and pile it in piles. So he was running. So the guy says to him, what you doing running like that? You're not supposed to be setting the pace. You see him? You go as fast as he goes, and you don't go any faster. He says, okay, I'm just trying to prove. Excuse me. I'm just trying to prove that I can keep up with everybody else. So the long story short, he works there for about a month. He makes about $30, and he's so happy. He's getting ready to go home. And the guy says, okay, so now you understand we're the industrial workers of the world, and you need to join. And so you can get a membership for 10 cents a month, and here's your card. And so my dad gave the guy 30 cents, and he had a little red card for being a member of the IWW. And at that time, I guess he might have been the youngest one, and also he was a black kid up in the Midwest. And so it was a pretty special designation.
What an amazing story.
So that's just one story.
We've just started. I can't wait for the rest of this.
But
fantastic. Yes, thank you.
I think that story is very important because he had although his mother was white, he was always around the Native Americans and the African Americans who were living in Sioux City. And he said he didn't know very many white people. And yet he had this experience where these grown white guys, stood up for his rights. He was a little scared because they were known for, they would burn somebody's field down, They were anarchists, I guess, in part. And, he was frightened by the whole thing. And he was also confused, and he spoke up when he spoke up to the guy. He says, you guys are calling me Shine and Coon and all those. That makes me feel kind of funny. I would prefer you just call me by my name. And that was kind of interesting, and most of them did, but they would forget and call him those names anyway. But I think that was a very formative moment for him, as well as having experienced as a child his mother's work in the packing house and the strikes there, which were very multiracial, multi-ethnic.
Now, did he tell you these stories when you were growing up? Did you know these stories of the unions? And
I only knew some of these stories. I didn't really get any of the details until we did an oral history on him in 1975. I knew about the Indians because they showed up in Los Angeles once. The whole family didn't tell anybody, and they just arrived, and we took care of them. Half of my cousins had TB, and they were put in sanitariums, but we had other cousins who would stay at different brothers' houses in LA. So I knew about that. Right. And we would do stuff like the squaw dance and things like that, and we would eat fry bread when they came. Yeah.
So you had some awareness of this.
Oh yeah, I had awareness of it. Yes, I did.
Yeah.
Yes, I did.
So how about, so you say your father eventually ended up in California, but can you tell us a bit about your mother?
Okay. Can I tell you a little more about my grandmother?
Absolutely.
So my father only went to about the 5th grade, and my grandmother was a real fighter and this is another part of making my dad who he was. For example, he loved school. He even talked about how he liked his teachers. This is when he would have been in Sioux City. And they had a substitute one day. And the substitute was mean. And she was hitting the kids on their fingers with a ruler. So he got hit once. And then I don't know what he did. He didn't even remember what he did. But she came back and hit him again. And he said to himself, she's not going to hit me no more. And he snatched the ruler out of her hand, broke it in half, and threw it out the window. Well, this substitute teacher kind of had a fit after that happened, very upset, and was kicking him out of school. He went home and told his mother what happened. His mother came back, and, they had inkwells at that time. And she just picked up the inkwell. She told off this woman for treating the children badly, and she threw the ink at this teacher. And then they marched away. Another time, they were trying to get enrolled in school, and they didn't have shoes. And they said, you can't have shoes? So his mother said, well, let's just go. They left, and he needed to find work anywhere, and that's when his education stopped. So imagine Sioux City, Iowa, and you don't have shoes.
Amazing. Yeah.
So my mother's family, that's another story. My grandmother comes from Vilna, which is Lithuania. We grew up understanding that it was sometimes Russia and it was sometimes Poland, and they were Jewish. And they immigrated. Well, the family was was revolutionary. They were anti-Tsar, and the family back there was Orthodox Jew, the family that she grew up in. But she and almost all of her siblings eventually came to the United States after 1905 revolution. And my grandfather was Russian, and I don't know where he was from, but Russian Jew. But he was a very angry, bitter, mean man. He had a shoe repair store in St. Louis. And when my mother later met my father in California, he disowned her, my mother, because my father was black. Well, we said Negro at that time. And so my grandmother decided to leave him because she was not going to disown her daughter.
Wow.
Yeah. And this whole, all of her siblings, they did not practice Judaism as a religion, really, but they spoke Yiddish. That was their main language. They were culturally Jewish, and they were all very, very progressive and involved in the movement in some way or another. My grandmother worked in the garment industry. My grandmother was very upset with the Jewish religion because, for example, the boys could go to school and she couldn't. So my grandmother was essentially illiterate. She could read a little bit of Yiddish, and she could, and very little bit of English her whole life. But they were always very, very progressive, and my parents met because at some Young Communist League party in Los Angeles. I have a lot of stories about how my father decided to become a communist. I don't know if you have time for them.
How about one or two?
One or two. So my father, when he was maybe 12, did a short job in the packing house, and just involved opening the doors so somebody else carrying a big hunk of meat could get through. And he worked as a shoe shine boy at different places for a lot of his life at that age. And as a shoe shine boy, somebody came by, some young woman, he said, came by, got her shoe shine, and then left him a copy of the Communist Manifesto. So he's trying to read the Communist Manifesto because he's kind of impressed. Nobody ever gave him a book before or anything, but he didn't have the skills to do it. So he asked his boss. And his boss says, "That's terrible. That's terrible stuff. He says, oh, okay, and he throws it away. And then when his boss is not there, he picks it up again. And he had a very good relationship with the banker in town, and even figured out how to borrow $50 from the banker for his brother to buy a truck. And he had this nice relationship, so he figured the banker could help him. So he shows the banker his copy of the Communist Manifesto, and the banker says, that's terrible, revolutionary crap, terrible, terrible. So my father throws it away again. But then he starts thinking, well, this is kind of an interesting book. And he keeps trying, but he really can't read it. And at some point, this young woman comes back and she says, how are you doing with the book? And he says, actually, I can't read it. I can't read well enough. I'd be happy to talk to you about it, but I can't read. And then he was invited to a party and was rather amazed, that the party was all white people. And he mentioned Jews and Russians and Scandinavians and things like that at the party. But everybody was nice to him and inclusive, and they started to, when they heard his stories, they could not believe his background, and that they were very friendly, and that's how he started to get involved. And then later on, working in the packing house, because he then got real job in the packing house when he was 16 or 17. And I guess he was talking to these folks at the time and talking to the workers in the packing house. And the packing houses actually haven't changed that much. He said we would be in a foot of manure and there would be blood everywhere and your hands would be very slippery and it was extremely dangerous, and there were always people at the doors ready to take your place, and they were always training new people. And they worked 10 to 13-hour days, and they had 20 minutes for a lunch break. And he talked about how they would drink blood just to keep themselves going. Some positions were not on a conveyor belt, but other positions were. And they would start at 250, sheep going by in the morning, and then they would gradually increase it, and sometimes it got up to 350. And so he talked to the guys and said, well, what are we going to do about this? Because it's so dangerous when it gets up, because people would cut themselves, very serious, no breaks. And he says, what are we going to do? And somebody said, well, if they go over 350, let's strike. My dad said, okay. Maybe he was the guy who said, let's strike. Anyway, of course, they went over 350. My dad said, hold the line, and they all walked out. So it was a wildcat strike. He got fired and blacklisted, and everybody else went back to work. But what's really interesting about that story is if you read the book Fast Food Nation, very little has changed, in fact. I mean, these packing houses are larger, but the jobs are very close to being as dangerous. And they talk about the speed of the line, exactly the same stuff. Mostly immigrant workers now.
Right, right. So, and this was in Los Angeles, right? And
the packing house
the
packing house was in Sioux City and then in Omaha, and then the Depression was very, very difficult. And after he got blacklisted, though, that's when he came to California. Okay. Yeah.
So perhaps, talking about California and how your parents met and then your own childhood.
Okay, so my parents met in the Young Communist League movement as well.
And how old were they?
They were probably in their young 20s, and it was interracial couples was illegal at that time, so they had a common law marriage. And my mother was kind of the person who kept my dad going, but she wasn't the person with the big stories who gave the speeches and things like that. He worked in California, all up and down the Central Valley with cotton compress workers, organizing for the CIO. And he also worked with the ILWU, organizing African American workers. And I think especially interesting for this project was that in the late 40s and early 50s, he was the director of the Civil Rights Congress in Oakland, California. And they worked on police brutality, housing rights. They were attacked by the Oakland Tribune, Noland newspapers. And one thing
they talked about lynching as genocide. This is a very important and little known organization. Yeah.
yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. And what I think what's really important is, yes, he did identify as a communist. But what the communists did was organize for people's rights, for decent wages, for a place to live, against police brutality, really basic people's rights. They weren't armed and going out to shoot people to have a revolution. It was their idea was, let's help the people where we are now. And that's part of the organizing effort for the Congress of Industrial Organizations too, the CIO, was to be much more inclusive in terms of who was unionized in an official way. Yeah.
And your parents had met as young communists. Did your mother retain those politics as well? And did she continue to work?
They didn't retain those politics. I mean, they both quit probably in the very early 60s because of lots of different issues that were going on. She did a lot of support stuff. Like I remember as a child going door to door selling the People's World and going to a few demonstrations like about the Rosenbergs, it seems to. I would have been pretty small. And my dad, even after he stopped working as an organizer for unions and became a shoe repairman, he would go hang out at the Laborers Local in Los Angeles, which was kind of a sold-out local, and then organize the workers to sort of struggle within the union to change. And he organized an organization called the Laborers Fraternal Order. And they had a logo, you know, they had these buttons, and they had a logo with a brown arm, a white arm, and a black arm. In fact, I have a brochure that shows you that.
That was called the Laborers Fraternal Organization?
Laborers Fraternal Order, I think. Yeah. And it was a support group. They had a baseball team, you know, it was community. A little bit like Pillars of the Community.
So can you tell us a little bit about your own, obviously just a very typical childhood. No, I'm just joking.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about your childhood.
Yeah. Well, my childhood was kind of interesting because I was the youngest. And so my brother and sister remember suffering more than I did. Some of my earliest memories when my father went underground. He disappeared during the McCarthy era. And of course, I didn't really know what that was about. But we lived with my Uncle Mark in Perris, California, Perris, which was one of the few places where black people could buy land in the 30s and the 40s.
Whereabouts is that?
It's off the 15, or is it off the 163? Not too far from Riverside.
Okay, yeah.
Southwest of Riverside. So it's a dry, rocky area. Very hard. You wouldn't make a living off the farm. And so we were country kids, and we looked like it in a couple of photographs that we have. My brother, at the age of 12, dug a well. This will give you an idea. He dug the well. He still had the chair before he died to show us what he had done. And everybody in that family worked very hard. Like I was like the assistant. So Bertie, go get this. Bertie, go get that. You know, I was that person because, you know, he needed somebody. My sister worked very hard, and they were very frugal. The family was very frugal. I didn't feel like I suffered at all. Right? I thought everything was fine. But once a week, we would go to the grocery store with my uncle's truck and take everything that they were throwing away. And we would bring that food back to our little farm. It was a 5-acre farm. To our little farm and sort through it and decide what we could keep to eat and what would go to the pigs. And we kind of did that, you know. My uncle also worked as a custodian on Camp Pendleton, and he got fired. And he got fired because he was my father's brother, period. This particular uncle was not political. And they were very religious. One of these sort of, it was the Church of God in Christ. What do they call it? They would sing, they would find the Holy Ghost, they would kind of like have fits and stuff and speak in tongues and everything.
Pentecostal?
I don't know technically. There's a couple of words for them. Anyhow, they had this rusty, dusty little church with benches that splinters and everything. And according to my brother and sister, we went like 3 times a week, not just on Sunday, but during the week. I don't remember so much about it, except I did have nightmares for about 3 years of the devil chasing me. What else did I want to tell you about this period? Oh, yes, we were followed. My brother, my sister, and my uncle would be often followed when we were driving around because the FBI would be in some black Ford or Chevrolet. And they would follow my uncle like we were doing anything. And so my uncle decided one day, he wasn't political, but still he wanted to mess with these guys. So he went and parked in a cul-de-sac. It's country, but it was like a dead end under a tree, and then just stayed there. So they had to be in the sun, and this would be 100 degrees in Paris, California. Then sometimes they go out and say, "What are you guys following us around for?"
Right.
So I remember that, and then we did eventually move. We moved to Venice Beach, actually, because my grandmother lived near. And so my mother took us off the farm and we moved to Venice Beach. And that was kind of a nice period. It was the one time I saw my grandfather. One time. I only saw him one time because my uncle came to town. He called his father and he said, "If you want to see me, you have to see Etty also and the kids." And so he came, and that was the only time that I saw him. But I also knew that I was missing my father so much, I decided to run away. I was like 5 or 4, and I fill up a pillow with all of my necessities, and my mom said, "Okay," and then I run away. I maybe made 1.5 blocks. I don't remember how it ended, but I didn't get very far. So as I was growing up, eventually my father had a heart attack, and so he came and lived with the family, and he learned how to be a shoe repairman just by apprenticing himself for free with a shoe repair fellow who taught him the trade. And we got a little shop, and we all worked in that shop, all 5 of us. And of course, I was still kind of young, so sometimes I would be in the back reading my books, and then sometimes I'd be on the cash register. And eventually, by the time I got to high school, I knew how to do some repair. I could put the heels on, and I could sand them on the machines and do a lot of that. So we spent a lot of time there.
And where was the shoe shop?
Well, the first one, we had one on Dinker Street, but then we had one on 39th and Western, and then the last one was across the street from the City Hall. And one day, I don't remember the year, my father's name appeared in the Los Angeles Times because he was being called before HUAC, House of Un-American Activities Committee. And a few months later, that shoe repair shop got shot into during the night. And the other thing that happened is we had been going to this camp called Anytown. And it was a very nice camp. It was organized by the National Conference of Christians and Jews, NCCJ. And my sister, it was very nice. My sister was elected the mayor of Anytown, and she was very proud of that. And there was kids from all different high schools, so it was a real mixture of people. And the director of that program called her in, and she asked her, "Is that your dad?" My sister said, "Yes." She said, "You can't be the mayor of this organization anymore." So that was devastating for my sister. And my sister remembers everything as we were poor, we didn't have stuff. She had to run the shoe shop for a whole week once when my parents were ill. And she was like in the 11th grade or something. She held down the entire fort. but she felt she suffered a lot behind that. So also in these years, I started to demonstrate in the civil rights demonstrations. But before we get to those demonstrations, like probably everybody you're interviewing who's my age, the first conversation that my father officially had with me about politics was when Emmett Till was murdered. Because we saw the jet, he showed me, he says, Bertie, that was my nickname, you have to understand what this whole country is like. And we had the Jet magazine and the pictures and everything. And that's my first political conversation that I remember ever having.
Do you remember your reaction to seeing the pictures, or to your father
I was
talking to you
horrified.
about it?
He said, you know, things are not the way you may think they are. And I want you to know this is something that has just happened. I was just absolutely horrified. I knew, I felt different because we moved around a lot, and sometimes when I was quite young, I was in schools with all white kids, and I felt somehow different. I ended up making good friends with the other black girl in the 3rd grade, and she was also tall, because that made it, I was very tall for my age. But I was not aware of that kind of violence. And my father is another thing he had done. He, of course, was very aware. When he was 13 or 14, a good friend of his brother was murdered by the police in custody, beat up and murdered. And nobody wanted to do anything about this. And my father collected money for the funeral, tried to get a church. The churches were intimidated and would not allow the funeral to be at the church. And they managed to do it, I don't remember where. And something he pointed out, he says, you know, the prostitutes were really good. They really contributed a lot of money because they understood what that kind of hardship was and that kind of brutality. So that's when I started hearing some of those stories from my dad, but that was the first conversation, Emmett Till. Something else that affected our childhood a lot was our parents' interracial marriage, because that was very unusual. And people would stare at us, and then we would smile back and stuff, but we were very aware of that. And my brother actually looks kind of like just a Jewish guy, and he would get into fights with people saying, no, I'm Negro. He would actually get into fist fights with them. I don't know if these were black or white kids, but my father said that his mother always told them, you're Negro. Don't let anybody tell you that you're anything else. And that's pretty much what my father told us as well.
Do you have a single memory of that, or that was just something
that was just a recurring theme. And it's particularly interesting because I'm the darkest of the siblings. So my sister could conceivably pass, and my brother very easily would pass. I mean, he would fight not to pass as white. So that was very important. And then I went to a lot of different schools, but then I started going to Berrindo Junior High School and Berrindo Junior High, and then to Los Angeles High. And our neighborhood, we eventually moved to an area of Los Angeles, such as like Adams in Vermont. And it had been primarily African-American neighborhood, but it rapidly changed into an immigrant neighborhood, mostly Central Americans. So I learned Spanish. So when I took Spanish in school, I talked to my neighbors and made friends with them. And at LA High, I was in very, very mixed classes. There were a lot of Jewish kids coming from, like the Fairfax area. There were a lot of Japanese kids, some of whom had been born in the internment camps. And there were a lot of African American kids, and we got along pretty well. I mean, there would be a fight in that school once every couple of months, nothing like you see today. But of course, we were very tracked. And in junior high and part of high school, that's when I started to do dancing. And it was through the dancing that I met some wonderful people who also were very involved in folk music. And I just was kind of like a weirdo, you know, because I liked this old time folk music and all of this stuff. My brother and sister, they were kind of like listening to Motown, but I was doing my own thing. And I eventually learned to play the guitar and the banjo. And I like different kinds of music. And I'm so happy to realize that I had an Uncle Earl who was a fiddler and played old time music way back in the early 1900s. He probably had a better ear than I had, but yeah, it's okay.
So this is, so what year did you graduate high school?
So I graduated, so I was involved in some of the demonstrations in Los Angeles, at Woolworths, and some of those kinds of things. And I decided I wanted to go to Berkeley, and I graduated in 1964.
Okay.
So I arrived in Berkeley in the fall of 1964.
Can I back you up just a little bit then to your early high school and you and your family's reaction to, well, we talked about Emmett Till, but back in 55 in Montgomery, or in 60 when the sit-in movement really starts to go throughout the South. Were you tracking that in Los Angeles? Were you getting news?
Basically we were constantly looking at all of this happening on the news. But that's the extent of it. We were just very excited about it all and watching it on the news and seeing how all of this was progressing.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so sorry to interrupt, but so
Right.
64, Berkeley.
So 64, because I had seen that there had been demonstrations at the Sheraton Palace I think it was to integrate the staff there. And all kinds of things had been happening at Berkeley, so I figured that was the place to go. And I managed to get in. They accepted me late because my grades weren't as good as they were supposed to be, but they got good enough because they saw my senior grades, and I went to Berkeley. So when I had got accepted, all of the like dorms and the co-ops and all of that, they were full. So my dad drove up with me and introduced me to different people that he knew from the movement in Berkeley. And the first student at Berkeley to really befriend me and help me was Bettina Apteker. And she was like, maybe she was a junior, maybe she was a sophomore. But she invited me to her house and she introduced me to a couple of people. And her father, of course, is like a renowned communist scholar, member of the Communist Party back then, and did a lot of African American history work. And I had heard of him, and I kind of knew that, these were established people. But anyway, she was very friendly. She had me over for dinner and helped me plan my classes and who the TAs were and what I should do. And that made all the difference in the world. I think if you were walking into that school and you didn't know anybody or you didn't have a group to associate with, you would really be lost. And so Bettina got me started, and I met a lot of very interesting people.
And did you just happen to meet her, or was that through your father's connections?
No, somehow, it wasn't just happen, no, it was through my father's connections, although he didn't introduce me to her directly. He introduced me to his friends, which were people like Jessica Mitford and, Roscoe Proctor, and a lot of activists from the Bay Area at that time.
Okay, so you really followed through your father's tracks.
It was through my
and
parents.
Yeah.
It was through my parents.
Amazing, yeah.
So I met people who were in the Du Bois Club and also in the Communist Party at that time at UC Berkeley. So what happens at UC Berkeley in the fall of 1964 is the free speech movement. And the free speech movement is largely because the students at Berkeley were mobilizing in support of the civil rights movement in Oakland and San Francisco at the time. And some of the people I met actually had been freedom riders the summer previous. And so when they tried to take down our tables and violate our right to free speech, we had a pretty massive movement, and I got arrested in Sproul Hall. And I was 17 at the time, but I told him I was 18 so that I wouldn't go off all by myself to juvenile hall or
Right.
something. I just gave him a different year. And my parents wouldn't have to come up to the Bay Area. So I participated in that, and that was very exciting, very, very exciting moment. Then the next major thing that happened at Berkeley is I decided I wanted to study abroad in Spain in 1966 and 1967. Of course, during this period, we were demonstrating against the war in Vietnam. We were demonstrating for civil rights. Very, very active. It was a very, very, very active period. So I decided I wanted to study in Spain. I was a Spanish major, by the way, which was rather an odd thing to be, but it was because of where I grew up. Well, through the eyes of a 17-year-old, I was ready for all of this. In many ways, this is why I went to Berkeley. I was very excited about the demonstrations. I was always out there passing out leaflets as a member of the W.E.B. Du Bois Club. And it was pretty early in the semester that the free speech movement got started, because it got started really quick. All it took was them to try to stop us setting up the tables. And I don't know what they wanted to do that for, because we really organized behind it. And so, of course, Mario Savio was one of the key figures, and we had rallies just about every day. Bettina Apteker also spoke. I spoke once as well, and started to get my, feet wet a little bit with, giving speeches and things like that. And it was mainly the free speech movement in 66, not 66, in 64, of course, that I remember. And exactly what happened between then and going to Spain, I actually can't remember. All of the things that we were involved in, but constantly involved, constantly doing things. So when I interviewed to go to Spain, they said, well, you got arrested in the free speech movement and you're going to a country that is a dictatorship. And I said, well, my purpose is to go study. So I go. And I get to Spain and to Madrid, and it truly was a repressive regime. You saw there were so many different kinds of police, and there were these police that you called the grises because they wore gray, and they would be standing on corners with submachine guns. You didn't easily meet other political people. We studied in what you call the facultad, of Facultad de Letras, de Filosofía y Letras.
Dan, did the Berkeley folks warn you at all? Like, be cool?
No, they asked the question, but
And then
I
they-
answered it to their satisfaction.
Okay.
So I would find out there was a demonstration a day later, because the way the Spanish students organized things is they would throw out leaflets, the demonstration would happen, then it'd be over. Because it's not something that you wait at the front of the campus and you pass out leaflets. That was not happening. And mostly they were demonstrating against the Franco regime and against the dictatorship. And I did eventually meet some Spaniards who were progressive and involved in some of this. And I said, well, what should I do? And they said, well, you should work with the American students because we're working with the Spanish ones. I said, okay. So what do? We set up a table. We get a table, we put it up in the Facultad de Filosofía y Letras, and we took signatures of people who were opposed to the war in Vietnam because we figured we better not touch Franco Spain. And I do believe that the purpose of collecting those signatures was to take them to the embassy, and that was naive on our part. But what was very interesting was with our little table there, and I don't even remember how many days we were there, the press came. Different people from the press, and they say, let us know if you ever get ready to do anything, because they wanted to be present, right? We say, okay, fine, we'll let you know. So I was really mostly depressed most of the time that I was in Spain. I didn't, find a boyfriend, and unfortunately didn't study flamenco guitar or whatever. But eventually by the spring I had quite a few progressive friends. Well, they were considered revolutionary at that time. And that was getting to be more and more fun. So they were planning to have big demonstrations against the war in Vietnam on April 28th, 1967. And they asked me if I would give a speech. And I said, I don't know, maybe I'll write a letter and you can read the letter. So the director of our program was Carlos Blanco Aguinaga. And he actually left Spain in the 30s as a child of Spaniards when the war was lost. And he lived in refugee camps in southern Spain, and he became a very prestigious professor in the University of California system. And Spain didn't even want to accept him as the director of our study abroad program, but UC actually insisted that he be accepted. So when he found out that I was some kind of an activist, because I avoided all authority, I didn't go anywhere near him, he called me into his office like in October. And he says, Roberta, Ronald Reagan is coming to town, and you could go to the airport. And he starts drawing me a diagram of the airport. And he says, and you can put a sign under your coat. And then when he gets there, you can open up your sign against the war in Vietnam and against Ronald Reagan. And I go, man, this guy's crazy. Fortunately, Ronald Reagan didn't come, because I think I might have gotten home sooner if he had actually come. But anyway, Carlos Blanco had a separate meeting with the American embassy, because they didn't meet with him with the rest of the directors. They met with him separately. And they basically told the directors of the programs, we can't protect your kids if they get involved in these demonstrations. So you need to tell them to stay out of the demonstrations. So Blanco has this meeting with all of us, and he tells us the same thing. And then afterwards, I tell him, well, you know, they've asked me to give a speech. And he says, Roberta, I know you'll do the right thing. He didn't tell me, don't give the speech. So the day of this event, I go, and they've taken over a whole building, and they have a sign like from the 5th floor to the 2nd floor, you know, Yankees fuera del Vietnam. Mind you, this is 1967 in Europe. People were burning little American flags and things like that. So I go into the room where it's supposed to happen. The room is packed. The sound system doesn't work, but they say, don't worry, they'll get quiet. Because the person before me, nobody was listening to everybody. It was just chaos. And the reporters were asking me, what are they saying? This is Spanish, you know, and the international reporters are asking me to translate for them. So it's my turn to speak. I wish I had saved that speech, but as soon as I get up there, I get this standing ovation, and then I make my points. Oh, they got quiet, of course, and I get all of these applause, and everything's just great. I'm so popular because I'm this like revolutionary student from the United States. And then it's over, and like 5 students come up to me and they say, okay, now we have to run out the back way through this little forest, and we have a taxi waiting for you. And that taxi, what you want to do is go to the train station and go straight to Andalusia, so that you can stay away for a couple of weeks, so this whole thing will cool down. And then they'll forget about you. And I'm going, I am 5 feet 10 inches. I am this color. I had also gained a few pounds. Like, I was so depressed, I was just eating at all hours. And I go, okay, let me think about it. And I go back to my apartment. I do take the taxi back to my little apartment, and I wasn't supposed to be living in an apartment. I was supposed to be living in a pension, because I broke all the rules. And I found my friend who lived in a pension a couple of blocks away. And she came over and she said, you know what, when I got back to my pension, the woman who runs the pension said that the police had been there looking for me. And this woman was a Franco sympathizer, but she told them to come back, oh, she'll be back in 4 hours, knowing that she would probably be back sooner. So she alerted us that the police were looking for us. So we said, oh, the police are looking for us. Oh, what are we going to do? And so we call Carlos Blanco Aguinaga, and he says, come to our house. And so we pack up our suitcases, and it's at an hour in Madrid where there aren't very many taxis. So we take this special kind of taxi, and we have suitcases. And my friend who was with me was blonde, and then there's me. And there was a third person on the list who was Carol Watanabe, a Japanese girl from Hawaii, because she had done a few things with us. So we're in the cab going to the director's office, and with our suitcases in the back, and the guy is listening to the radio. And the announcement comes on, el gobierno de España está buscando estas mujeres, una chica de color, una japonesa y una rubia. You know, and so he looks, the chica de color is particularly exotic for Spain at that time. It was very provincial. So he looks at his rear view mirror. He doesn't say anything, but he drops us off. And so there we are at the director's house, and we probably stayed there 2 or 3 days. It was very clear nobody's going to forget about us, because they were making inquiries at the university. There were different levels of sort of spies at the university repeatedly, and the American embassy as well was making inquiries. Where are they? So we say, okay, let's just face the music. So we went back to our apartments. Well, she was in a pension. I was in an apartment. So I get to my apartment, and I'll leave out the story about eating my yogurt and walking past these people downstairs and all of that. There were some guys, and I just walked past them a couple of times, and then eventually they come up and they say, knock, knock, you know, are you Roberta Alexander? Plainclothes. I say yes. And they say, well, we're the plainclothes police, and we're supposed to take you in. I say, okay. And then we walk from my apartment to the Puerta del Sol, and we stop for coffee. From my apartment to the Puerta del Sol, which was mostly downhill, and it was a central jail. And at the Puerta del Sol, at the jail there, you go downstairs. It's like a dungeon. And I'm down there by myself because my friend hadn't gotten there yet. And somehow they had figured out the other prisoners, because they had arrested a number of people because they were doing it before the May Day demonstration, so they did it preemptively. So there were a lot of people in the jail, and they figured out that I was from the United States. I tried to pretend like I didn't speak Spanish. That didn't go anywhere, though. And they started singing We Shall Overcome. So to make that long story a little bit shorter, I was deported, but I think it was more like I was kidnapped by the Spanish state under the orders of the American State Department, because everybody we asked said, I said, why are you arresting me? We don't know, the American Embassy wants us to do it. They'd said that. They said that at every level. We don't know, we don't have anything to do with this. And we were put on a train. There was a row of police with my friend obviously eventually showed up with their machine guns. At every stop, there would be Guardia Civil, the guy who wore the funny hats, right outside our car. I mean, we were 20. And they took us to Irún. We crossed the border to Henday. And Carlos Blanco was there waiting for us. He had made that trip. He had driven up to give us money and to set us up. So there's a little more to the story. We take the train to Paris, and there were some immigrant workers like from Morocco, and we're trying to tell them what happened to us, and we're sharing food, and there were some newspaper articles, and we were trying to show them. And we get to Paris, and I say, okay, everybody, you hand me your bags, because we don't have money to pay anybody to help us. And there's a whole bunch of people gathered around. Guy comes up and he says, are you Roberta Alexander, Carol Watanabe, and Karen Nguyen? And we said, yes. And he says, I'm from CBS. And we have a limousine to take you to the Hôtel Georges V, which is the fanciest hotel in Paris. But what we need you to do is give us an interview tomorrow morning at 5:30 so that we can have it in the States for the for the evening news. And we said, okay. So then we're taken off to the Hotel Georges V.
It's a nice hotel.
It was very, we were so
Sure.
fancy. We had to eat and all of that. And the one unfortunate thing is my parents, somehow a radio station got through to me. A Los Angeles radio station got through to me when I was under house arrest during this whole bit, because they took us out of jail and put us in house arrest. And I gave them an interview, and my parents heard it, because I hadn't been able to get hold of my parents. And then, of course, they see this well, then when I got to Paris, I called them, and then they see this interview on CBS, and they were very proud. But there was reason to be afraid. Had it been Latin America, it may not have turned out the same way. So they gave us a very kind of like human interest interview, a very friendly interview. And we got to New York, and we came back. We got back to, went straight back to Berkeley.
How was your reception at Berkeley? Are the students following this?
Some people followed it. I was very disappointed in the people around the Du Bois Club and the Communist Party, because they were kind of like disinterested. I didn't see the fervor. And it's about when I left. I went around and talked to Abraham Lincoln Brigade people. My uncle was in the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, actually. And so I talked to them. And so then, I don't know if they invited me to go to a celebration of the fall of the Nazis in Germany. And they wanted each delegation to have one older person and a youth. And so these Abraham Brigadistas, said, would you like to be the youth? So I went to this thing in East Germany, and to speak at like something before, 750,000 people. But it was a very, very, very interesting trip, because what they did is they fed us wonderful food. We had translators, but there was no good political conversation. It was just kind of dead. The only time I really had a good time was when I ran into some printers from Cuba, people who were studying printing in East Germany, and they were from Cuba. Well, I could talk to them by myself, for one, and they were like full of, this was 67, and they were very enthusiastic and interested in talking about all of these ideas. But I got an idea of kind of what the Soviet bloc was like, and it wasn't looking too good to me. And then I spoke in front of a crowd. These Germans, they timed everything, your talk can be 75 seconds, but don't sit down until the interpreter finishes, because they're simultaneous. Yeah, it's like simul, but it's not exactly. So the German takes much longer to say anything, and so the simultaneous interpreter would take a couple sentences longer. When I finished, I forgot, and I sat down. The Soviet youth was about 50 years old. And it was just all not looking too good to me. So it changed my attitude toward that whole deal. So I came back to Berkeley.
We were rolling again.
Okay, so 1967, back to Berkeley.
Okay, 1967, back to Berkeley. I quit my associations with the Du Bois Club and sort of the Communist Party group. And I got involved with incredibly sectarian, revolutionary, quasi-revolutionary intellectuals group for a little while. That didn't last. And I found out, and then I got into another one of those groups. And the other one of those groups, which wasn't quite as narrow, they says, well, we don't take black people have to join the Black Panther Party. That was the Revolutionary Union, Bob Avakian. He was the leader. And that was probably just as well. It was just a good thing. I had much better feelings at this point about the Black Panther Party than I had had previously, because they started doing the community programs. They started doing breakfast for school children and all of those kinds of programs. And I liked the 10-point platform. I thought it was relevant, still relevant today.
What was your initial impression? You said that it wasn't as positive at first.
Well, I just thought at first, and this is really colored by a sort of narrow view of what's correct. I just was not impressed by. Well, I had heard Bobby Seale speak, and I was thinking about it today. You know, we want our share of the pie or something like that, and I thought, well, I'm a socialist. I want to divide up the pie between everybody. But actually, you know, our piece of the pie maybe wasn't that wrong in retrospect. I mean, I just didn't respond to it. So I started to be involved in the Black Panther Party by first going to the Breakfast for School Children program. And it was at a church in Oakland, and it was at the church where there's a famous photo of Charles Bussey, you know, serving people's, Charles Bussey, I think, serving people eggs and bacon. And we worked really hard, and that was a lot of fun doing that, you know, getting up and cooking the food, and then we also would go around asking for donations of the food. But the leadership of the party at that time, they were pretty sharp. And they found out pretty quickly that I could spell, I could type fast, you know, and I was pretty well educated. And so they assigned me to work on the Black Panther newspaper. So I was in the office, I think it was Shattuck, I think it was Berkeley. But I was in the national office, and it was technically Berkeley. But I think it was considered the Oakland national office. It was South Berkeley. And so that's where I met Big Man, because he was the editor of the newspaper, and that's where I spent a lot of time. Now, if you're a Black Panther, it's not like I go to a meeting a couple times a week. It was full time. We pretty much gave our entire life. We'd show up in the morning, or people would have slept there all night, and we get your assignments from the officer of the day, who could have been a 17-year-old, you know, deciding. There was a woman named Marcia, and I'm sure she was 17 when she was telling people, okay, you go here, you go sell newspapers, you do this, you do that. So I did a little bit of everything. I sold newspapers, I did everything, but basically I ended up working on the paper. And so Big Man would pick the articles, and I would type them into the adjuster writer, which was this old machine that would line it up. And I would correct the spelling and put in a few periods, that kind of thing. And then once a week, we would go to the printers, which was in San Francisco, in what was the Tenderloin district. And we would spend maybe 24 hours there laying out the paper, you know, because you'd have your copy and then you'd run it through this wax machine,
sure.
And then you could put it down, and then you do your headlines, and then Emory Douglas would show up, who's the artist for the party. I hope you're interviewing him. You are?
Now we are.
The artist for the party. All of that art was Emory Douglas, and he'd come in with different art things, and he had a better eye, of course, for how to lay things out, and then we'd go home exhausted. And for some of that time, I lived in North Richmond behind a church. And for some of that time, I lived in another area of North Richmond. Now, the reason I ended up in Richmond, part of the reason was one of the problems that I had in the Black Panther Party was being harassed by the guys. It was just being harassed, you know, and it was kind of the thing like, we're all revolutionaries and everything belongs to everybody, including, you know, you should be doing some, you know, revolutionary sexual favors for me. I did not buy that. And I got into a relationship with a nice guy, but in some ways it protected me as well. So, you know, I liked him, but there was also some protection. His name was Bobby Bowen, and he was from the Richmond area. So,
Can we talk a little bit more about the gender relationships in the party?
yeah.
We've got a few hours.
Everybody's story will be different depending on where you were and when you were there. So I was there in 1969. Eldridge Cleaver was already gone. And I wasn't impressed by his book, Soul on Ice. Somehow raping white women didn't seem like a revolutionary act to me, although I could see that he was brilliant. I had worked as an overseas operator for a while because I was working, I worked in canneries and stuff because I was going to organize the industrial proletariat for a while. I worked as an operator, and he had those kind of phones that you have on a boat. And he was rude to us. And you knew it was Eldridge Cleaver, because who else is going to have a black accent, with this over and out phone? And all of the leadership, when I was there, they were men. And Huey was in jail too. So the people who were the leaders were Bobby Seale, David Hilliard, Maasai, very important person, Hewitt, Ray Hewitt, and it was the three of them above all. And Big Man was like the next tier, but it was like this group, and then there might be one or another coming in. And they made the decisions. Now, they were smart. They were very smart. They had lots of interesting ideas. So they called the shots. But there was like a class division. They were up there drinking, I don't know, Chivas Regal. And we were drinking Bitter Dog, which was, I'm sure you all know, tawny port and lemon juice. And it actually tasted pretty good. And it's probably gut rot, but we were drinking it. And I go, they're drinking the Chivas Regal. We're drinking tawny port and lemon juice. That was one item. They all hit on me at one or another time, but David Hilliard was very persistent, and I had a real problem with him. I was told to drive him home. Yeah, it was David. I was told to drive him home from something one night, and he says, well, let's stop by your house. And I foolishly kind of did. And I was supposed to be getting ribs ready for a picnic the next day. One problem, though, is I didn't know how to do it. Forget, my mom's white, right? Mom's was Jewish. And my dad may have known how to do it, but I didn't know. So he makes this big deal, makes fun of me, whatever. We get the ribs in the oven, because you get them cooked, and then later you put them on the barbecue. You don't cook them on the barbecue. Okay. And then he starts looking, and then it's very, very uncomfortable, and he makes a lot of advances. And I say, no. And he doesn't force it. So I drive him back to his mother's house in West Oakland. And I go to the picnic the next morning, and all these people come up and say, where's the chairman? Because everybody knew that he had gone home with me, and I am inferring that everybody assumed that I had slept with him and he was coming back, with me. No, I held the line on that. And I've subsequently been told that we had agency with you, Roberta. Of course, I didn't even know what they meant by agency, but I mean, this is far subsequently. What do you mean by agency? Well, you have some control over what you do. So that kind of stuff really bothered me, but it stopped once I got into a relationship. Okay. Then there's the big United Front Against Fascism it's in the summer of 1969, because I was in the party only in 1969. They had figured out that I could give a pretty good speech, I guess. They had me doing political education classes, and they asked me to speak at this event, and it was in a big park. And people came from all over the country. I thought it might be a little premature to say it was a fascist country, but it's okay. So I gave a speech about women at this United Front Against Fascism. And Eldridge had come out with women are our other half, not our lesser half, but our other half. So that all sounded very good. But I talked some about...
a little bit better than what he had been saying earlier. Perhaps.
Saying and doing.
Yeah.
So I used that, and I think I talked about relationships evolving, and yes, there's problems, but we're with the brothers, because part of the issue was there was the women's liberation movement, and then there was questions whether or not women should be in the Black Panthers or should they be in the women's liberation movement, because clearly, you know, there were all of these issues in the Black Panthers, and I believed at that time that the right place to be was in the Black Panther Party. So I gave the speech. After the speech, Angela Davis came up and introduced herself to me because she hadn't yet hit headlines. And it was the strangest thing that somebody, a PhD student at UCSD, it was just like so strange. But she told me Carlos Blanco Aguinaga told her to introduce herself to me. But after that, they decided at some point that Big Man and I would go to Japan together. There was an invitation from the Zengakuren, and there were tickets. So they decided to do this, and I talked to Masai, and I said, look, Masai, I'm not going to talk straight nationalism, because sometimes the Panthers would be more nationalistic than other times. Most of the documents are international, very, very international, but that wasn't always how everybody saw things. And he said, fine. So I'm sort of the tag team with Big Man, you know, and so sometimes I'd say, Big Man, we have to do it this way or we have to do it that way. So, but before that happened, we get to the airport in Tokyo, and there's like some kind of cloak and dagger scene going on that we can't possibly understand. But one group comes and they pick us up and they say, hey, we have to get out of here fast. And we get in some car, and they're driving, and this is Big Man's memory mostly, so driving so fast, and it's kind of scary. But anyway, we find out a few days later that these people are misinterpreting what we were saying, and that they were the Red Army. And I don't know if you remember, but the Red Army did stuff like blow up railroad tracks and that kind of stuff. And Black Panther Party was not doing that kind of thing. And so we had to disassociate ourselves from them. And it's very hard. You can't read anything in Japan, and you can't hear any words that you might understand, you know, because it's a European language. And so we got set up with a group that did films for the left. It was called Ogawa Productions, and they had relationships with everybody on the left, and the left was very divided in Japan at the time. Their universities were occupied, and then somebody be thrown off the 5th story or something like that. But with these people, we got around. We also found out, I don't know, in my mind, we realized, but we should have known, we only had one-way tickets. So we had to figure out a way to make some money. So we did that by charging for interviews.
Okay.
So
what did you understand as your mission? I mean, what was the point of the trip?
That's a very good question. Our mission that's very interesting. We saw our mission as to get out the story of the Black Panther Party. And I think we also saw to learn about what's happening in Japan and come back and share it. And there were a lot of things happening in Japan that we were very unaware of.
Were there others going to other countries, or was this the major trip for
this
that?
was an accident, see? They somehow contacted the Black Panther Party national headquarters and said, we have a ticket. And a lot of things, I think, happened like that. 1969 was a particularly chaotic year. The Panther Party had already grown so much. Something that I have not mentioned is that it was clearly infiltrated. There was provocateurs going on. People will show up, I just got out of prison, I want to join the party. In Richmond, this guy came up to me. I was driving, mind you, a little white Rambler. You know, these were these little square, innocent-looking cars. And he says, I want to put some knives in the trunk of your car for now. And I said, no. And do you know, the next morning, on my way from North Richmond, in this area that's completely abandoned before you can get onto the freeway going towards Berkeley and Oakland, I hear a siren. I pull over, and within 30 seconds, there were 7 or 8 cars there, screeching in, and they searched everything. And I don't think it was a coincidence that it happened the day after this guy wanted to get in my trunk, put whatever he wanted in my trunk. I think I was pretty lucky to get out of that one. So they got an invitation to Japan, so we go to Japan. It happens to be that this journalist from Denmark comes and gets to know the Black Panthers, and then they have a trip to Scandinavia. And they're going to, in the reunion, they're going to have a panel on foreign relations. Now, there was other stuff that was much more official when they go to China. They really met, leaders in China and I guess in Algeria. They were recognized while Eldridge was still part of the Panthers before the split. So so we just, okay, you're going to go to Japan now. It wasn't like, okay, we want you to do this, this, and that. No. And I think that maybe at one time they would have been that organized, but not in 1969. So what we did is we wanted to spread the message of what was happening with the Black Panther Party. We wanted to support the movements in Japan to the degree that we could figure out who's who, and then we had to earn our keep, earn our tickets. And so we actually had some very interesting trips. We met with little old women who are probably half my age now, who were sitting in and sleeping in on American airport strips, military base airport strips. We met the second and third sons of farmers, because the system for inheriting land was the first son inherits land. Second and third then are pretty much a separate caste, actually. And they would go to the cities and do construction work. People wouldn't marry them. It was very much a caste-like system. And we met with the Korean immigrants and workers in Japan and had no idea that there were all of these things going on. The one place, and this was thanks to this film production company. They had relationships with all these people and they helped set it up. We were followed the entire time, except in my memory when we were with one particular interpreter. I mean, this Japanese guys, and they were out there waiting. We'd catch a cab and they would follow us. And once the cab wanted to tell us he didn't know where it was, and we thought he was being racist, and we insisted, because you would write down what it was. And he was all up someplace, and he stopped and asked, and then the car behind stopped and asked, where they're going, and they just followed us. Everything we did was public, but whatever. We just, we were followed. The one thing that everybody was united on at that time was to fight the construction of the new airport, because it was on wonderful farming land, and there were already enough air bases that could have been accommodated with some of these U.S. air bases. And there were demonstrations of hundreds of thousands of people. And we spoke at that too. And it was really interesting, because in their demonstrations, the Japanese, they lock arms and they tend to run. But not everybody. There's a role for everybody. So for the old folks, they would collect night soil. Do you know what night soil is? I do. They would collect night soil, and the cops would run. They would have a net over them to try to protect themselves from rocks and stuff, but it didn't protect them from the night soil. And so they would be throwing this shit. It would go through. It was this real problem, and other people be running, and I can't remember. But when your demonstration is over, since you're running most of the time, you feel pretty good. I don't know how much was accomplished, but there were massive demonstrations, and we spoke there. We also met with farmers, peasant farmers, and we saw a lot. We saw a lot of amazing things in Japan. When I got back...
So how long did you end up staying?
I think we were there at least a month. maybe 5 weeks. I have the notes someplace, some notes, just where we had gone. And Big Man didn't come back with me. Big Man had to go to, he went to Europe. There was something he was supposed to do, or to, I don't know, there was something he was supposed to do. He didn't come back to me, with me. I get back, and then, of course, they have a separate customs just for me with a Japanese guy there. And they ask for my telephone book, and I said, no, you can't see my telephone book. And so whatever, I got past it. Yeah. And so that was really the last big thing that I did in the party. I quit not too long after it. And
Was it easy to get out?
You just walked away.
Okay.
Now, but this is what happened. The whole time, well, first of all, there were levels of activities that I wasn't involved in the Panthers. The office was metal plated, and there were sandbags in the office. So I want to remember that I'm kind of oblivious to all of this. And then there were other stuff. There was gun stuff going on, and I was not part of it. They sent me to be trained to the shooting range or something. I shot a .357 Magnum one time. I thought my arm was going to fall off. And I shot an F-16, does that sound right? One time, I thought my shoulder was going to fall off, and it was noisy, and I didn't want to have anything else to do with it, and I did not. So I'm sure some of the people you're going to be talking to know much more about all of that, but I really, in a naive way, didn't. But what I did notice is about once every 2 weeks, there would be fire engines on each side of our block. One here and one there. And that was kind of weird. What's the fire engines there for? And then a newspaper. It was not the Berkeley Barb, but another one. I don't remember the name, but I have it somewhere. A Berkeley newspaper found the Berkeley police plan for how they would vamp on the office. And one of the things that I remember, actually you could find that on the internet now. I think that's where I found it. One of the things that I remember is that they would have the fire engines there because somehow they would blast their way into downstairs, and then they would take these machine guns or whatever they are, and they'd go like that, and then the upstairs would be on fire. And I'd be up there typing that shit, on my little adjuster writer, and so I go, whoa, and I kind of saw, this really is. I mean, I had been writing. Fred Hampton hadn't been killed yet, but so many people had been arrested that year. So many offices had been vamped on. I don't know, but reading this made it really come home. And so, 1, I did not want to die for the Black Panther Party. 1. 2, I felt the party was infiltrated. And a lot of times, those infiltrators are the ones that bring you the guns and encourage or even carry out some of the crazier activities. I never had in my mind a way to have a revolution that we could shoot our way into in this country that could be done through violence. Even though I thought in revolutionary terms and all that violence part of it, I never, can't even shoot a gun. And 3rd, I was pregnant, and I was not ready to take the responsibility of having a child. And so for those 3 reasons, I told them I'm going to go visit my parents, but I didn't come back. Subsequently, David Hilliard figured out who had all my books, because I had this huge library, Mao and Lin, all the revolution marks and stuff. And he came and intimidated those folks and took all my books. So the one thing is, I think this was a period in the party where there was like a purge kind of thing going on. So somebody would leave and they call him a running dog, lackey, several other words. They never published anything like that about me. I sent them everything I had from the Japan trip, and I was sorry that I did that, but somehow subsequently a lot of that's been recovered because we had a woman who was doing research on that project for us, and she found out a lot of that information. So then I was back in the United States and with my parents. I lived there for a year, and I talked to Carlos Blanco because I was doing a typing job at that point. And he says, come down to San Diego because we are starting Third College. Can we stop for a minute?
Sure. I'll bring you back to where we stopped, which was Third College in San Diego.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I gave you the wrong name. It was Lumumba Zapata College.
Okay.
Okay. So what had happened in fall of 68 and 69 is students at that college, including Angela Davis and African American students and the Chicano students, they got together and they said, we want a college that will teach us our history, as well as white students were involved in it as well.
And these were students who were originally at San Diego State?
They were already at UCSD.
Oh,
It's
UCSD. Okay.
Because the way they were developing UCSD was to have colleges so that the university wouldn't feel so inhumane or, there'd be an intimate touch. And they actually, and this is when there was a lot of organizing going around all over for ethnic studies departments and all of that. And I went to a lot of those demonstrations. I do remember those. And they were granted Lumumba Zapata College, but that was the temporary name. So the university called it Third College. So when I called Carlos Blanco, he says, come down, we can get you a job at Third College. So what am I, 23? They have me interview for the resident dean position. And the people on the interviewing committee are students and a couple of other people. And they give me the job of resident dean of Third College, the first year of its existence.
Start at the top. I like it.
Yeah. So, okay. So to be resident dean, one of the perks is you have this house. And around the house, which is, like a 70s kind of, flat house kind of thing. And all around the house are the big dorms. Okay. And they've been doing recruiting of students to come to Third College, at all levels, but especially the freshman level, and recruiting faculty and staff and administrators. Okay. So far, so good. But from the very beginning, this effort was infiltrated. So that there were a couple of administrators who the university insisted be hired, even though the committee, the so-called, committee led by students, faculty, and staff didn't want that person to be hired. They insisted some of these people be hired. And this individual stood up at the very first meeting and started talking about the black people don't have the same, this is not serving black people, this is just serving you whites and Chicanos. And so it was very divisive from the very beginning. And here I am in this fishbowl with the students around. And amongst the student body, the same thing had already happened. In fact, there were guys kind of very similar to some of them who showed up in the Black Panther Party. I'm out of prison, the kind who they stare at you and they never take their eye away because that's how they've learned to behave, and to intimidate and to be the alpha individual. There were those. And I very early on was attacked because, look at my background. I grew up in a Latino area. I've been in the Black Panther Party. I've been to Spain. I danced with my progressive friends. I even sing folk music, and I was attacked for having relationships with everybody. I was even told at a BSU meeting, Black Student Union meeting, Roberta, as far as we know, you like Chicanos better than you like black people. It was that kind of thing. It was extremely divisive. And we had courses like Third World Studies. We had some fabulous professors. And I don't think there was a university in this country that had, to the degree that we had it, that amount of control, had that potential to be something fabulous. But I'm quite sure it was probably part of the COINTELPRO program, just like the Panthers had suffered from the COINTELPRO program. There was no doubt about it. And it turned into, like, I have a tendency when things are really bad to forget. But I was threatened one night at gunpoint. And I left and I went to Carlos Blanco's house. You know, he just keeps coming up, you know. And they go, Roberta, don't you remember? This is what they said. This is what they did. They said they're going to get you and stuff. And that's why you know. So, okay, yeah. And so it was a very, very difficult time. So I quit after 9 months because, among other things, I was not a good resident dean. I was supposed to be putting on dances and things, and I was supposed to say, oh, you broke a window, okay, your family's going to have to pay for it, and all that kind of stuff. And I was awful. It was absolutely awful. It was the wrong job. I didn't like it. I actually probably quit before I was going to get fired. So I quit, and I applied to 2 places for graduate school. I applied to the School of Education at Harvard because they had sent me some advertisement when I was a senior at Berkeley. And I applied to the literature department at UCSD. Well, Harvard offered me a full scholarship to be in their master's program, and I figured that wasn't going to make it because it was cold back there, and I was a little insulted. And so I did the program at UCSD. I got a PhD in comparative literature.
Let me ask you one quick question, just going backtrack for just a second. Did you, because you were talking about folks challenging you sort of on the variety of your interests and your background while at the Third College. Did this come up in the Black Panther Party as well at all?
You know, not so much, but it came up around food. Okay, so you heard my story about the ribs. So there were a lot of light-skinned, there were a number of light-skinned people. There is antagonism based on skin color in the Black community. And people who are lighter skinned are seen as, you know, more privileged, and some people find them more attractive, or all that kind of stuff. And there's a long history of that in this country. Right. That didn't make itself apparent to me while I was in the Black Panther Party. But having been raised by a Jewish mom who wasn't even that good a cook, we once in a while had to cook for everybody. So me and this other girl, and her name was, I want to say, Shelley. Her name was Shelley. And she was very light-skinned, and clearly her mom was white too. It was one of those things. And we had to cook. So I had a specialty, which was tuna casserole, that comes out of the Joy of Cooking book with Kellogg's, not frosted, but flakes that you put on top to give it that little crunch, and probably cream of mushroom soup. No, that did not go over. Me and Shelley were the only people eating that thing. Nobody ate that shit. We heard about it. We heard about it later. I did my best.
What's this mayonnaise?
But you know, another contradiction for me, I'll be honest, you know, is very often there were so many times when African American men would be with white women, especially in the educated zone, you know, that I would kind of like, and yeah, but then it's kind of hard because my mom's white, you know, so there is that. It's a very, very, very complicated dynamic. And working on the project that I've been working on recently, I hear a little bit about it sometimes. It's not hostile, but you know, that's a dynamic, and it's out there. Status based on skin color.
Right. Well, thank you for answering that. So back to, starting your graduate program.
Right.
UCSD. Yep.
So that was just a lot of fun. You know, it was a graduate program. At that time, there were grants. I got a Ford grant, which, you know, if you read Naomi Klein, you know, was a lot dirtier than I may have thought of, but they didn't influence what I was doing. And I got a PhD in comparative literature, but I probably was in the wrong area because my my dissertation was the fictional portrayal of popular movements. So I read these different books, about Haiti and Cuba and Mexico and the United States, about slave rebellions and revolutions. And that's what I wrote about. But then, after I got that degree, I only applied to one college, and I recognized that I didn't want to be in the academy. I didn't want to have that publish or perish, and the kind of competition that I saw within faculty members and, that whole process. And so I actually started teaching adult school for a while. And I taught adult school, mostly ESL, and a lot of refugees from Vietnam for about 12 years. And that was interesting too, to hear their stories, because that forced me to see things in a little more complex way. And then, fortunately, I was recruited to organize the ESL program at City College. And that's where I was for the last 25 years. And I feel like at City College, my contribution was primarily becoming the department chair, and I was there at the time for the English department, and I was there at a time when I could really turn around the composition of the faculty, so that we have an increasingly diverse faculty, a progressive faculty, and a very dedicated faculty, and the department functions well. And that's quite a good legacy, because there's a lot of non-functioning, dysfunctional English departments out there, and every other kind of department. So that was good. But also at City College, I also was responsible for about 4 or 5 years for the Labor Studies program. It was a program that was floundering for a while. It's always a difficult program to make successful in San Diego. And so we offered an AA, an associate's degree in labor studies. And so it would be a class in the history of labor. And now there is a class, I wasn't involved with that, in organizing. And then there's lots of classes like workers' compensation and disability, and a lot of things about law, and how to be, as well as leadership classes. And I introduced the occupational safety and health classes. And those are very important, and we got a bigger variety of people to come to those classes. And we worked with people from the UCLA labor program to organize those, and people from up there came down to teach a number of those classes. One of the reasons I think it's difficult is because I'm not sure the leadership of all the unions really want to develop the next generation to take their place. That's one. Now that would be different for different locals and different leaders. Another one is many of them have their built-in classes that they give for shop stewards or whatever, so there's some, overlap or redundancy. So that is one of the struggles. I used to go to the meetings of the Central Labor Council and regularly, and they would say, this is good, this is good, this is good, this is good, but then they didn't send the people to the classes, so it's always a struggle to keep your classes full. Now there is a labor studies program in Los Angeles, LA Trade Tech, I believe, which is very successful, and we're trying to follow some of his examples, but it hasn't taken off. So anytime there's a fall in enrollment, we have a fall there. However, they are doing some very interesting things now. They're developing internships for people, and they're working with CPI. What does it stand for?
Center for Policy Initiatives?
Yeah, it's local Center for Policy Initiatives, and so they're getting a lot of really good hands-on experience, and they're getting paid for doing it as well. So there is pretty good cohort of people who are going through that. So those, that covers 25 years of my life, but there was a lot of work, and I felt I was able to do productive, really good things there. I also taught in the Chicano Studies program.
Oh, you did?
Yeah, and there was a little bit of, there was a little bit of conflict, but yeah, some people wanted to keep me out, but she had no reason, an administrator, to do so. I says, if you don't want me to do it because I'm not Chicana, just say that and I won't do it, because, But that wasn't it. Oops, did I mess something up?
Yeah.
That, it didn't turn out to be a problem. Actually, that was one of my favorite places. Black studies I would have liked to have taught, but it just didn't work out. Just didn't work out because I was the big English person.
Did Third College survive?
Yes, in a sense. It's now called Thurgood Marshall. And I think most of the curriculum, there are still some elements from Third College, but it certainly is not the revolutionary experiment that it started out to be.
It's not Lumumba Zapata.
It's not Lumumba Zapata. I don't know that it's serving Latino, African American, and poor folks population in the same sense. Yeah. I mean, look at when I went to Berkeley, there was not even 1% African American, right? I think we're getting close to that too, and on the UCSD campuses, I mean, it's very, very low.
So it was up and falling, fallen. Was it up higher?
Oh yeah,
at one point?
for a while it was up higher. Well, with Third College and with affirmative action, but that has fallen to as low as it was in 1964 on some of these campuses. Have a lot of Asian, but they do not have that kind of representation. They do have quite a lot more Latino and Chicano. But City College is very mixed. It's still much more heavily Latino now because that's what's happening with the demographic. But yeah, no, we've gone back. We've gone back. I mean, to think that the packing houses are in many respects just as bad as they were when my father was working there in 1932 or something, and not in unions. To look at the police brutality that we have now and the murders, just as well. I don't have off the tip of my tongue what's happening in the South, but in Oakland, California, it's similar to where we are now. Not very cheery. Yeah. But there is some good stuff.
Okay.
All right, there's some good stuff that I think is very important. And I don't think it's just unique to San Diego, but it is a little bit unique to San Diego. There is a community organization called Pillars of the Community, and I'm now relatively active in at least one aspect of that organization. It's a faith-based organization, but Muslim. See, my family, we got the black, we got the Jewish, and pretty much the only thing that was left that people would be mad at would be the Muslim. So my son decided to fix that, and he converted to Islam a long time ago, 20 years ago. So now I got the Muslim thing, and so I got grandsons whose mother's from Gujarat. Gujarat is an interesting place to be Muslim. So I got Urdu-speaking grandsons who wear their kufi. And then I've been to weddings with the yarmulke. We got it all covered.
To
What's
the reservation? Back to the
I
Indian
forgot.
reservation?
Yeah, that's right. And the Native American stuff. Yeah. So our family kind of just happened that way. So it's a faith-based organization, but there's a lot of people who are not Muslim who are served by the organization and also work within it. They have a storefront in Encanto in Southeast San Diego, which is not unlike the Black Panther storefronts that we used to have, except this one doesn't have 2 stories. And there's a lot of community activities that take place. Jess would be probably more prepared to go through all of them, but one of the emphases is helping people who get out of prison adjust and succeed in life outside of prison. Other things that they are doing is they're organizing within the community to get people more politically active. A major thrust of campaign now is the San Diego 33 campaign. And that's because in the whole state of California, I'm not sure the whole state of California is aware of this, there's a penal code 182.5. And that penal code is the gang documentation, and it's based on one of these California initiatives that got passed in the early 2000s. And it says if they can demonstrate that you've done 2 or 3 things, then they can say you are a gang member. So those 2 or 3 things can be if you happen to be wearing the color green, if you happen to be standing in your neighborhood in front of your grandmother's house, which somebody decided is a gang house, if you happen to be talking to a gang member, which could be your neighbor, right? That's enough. And God forbid you do rap and put it on the internet, right? That's enough. You're a documented gang member, but you don't know that. And the documented gang members are from the ages of 9 up. And there's thousands of them in the state of California. And so the district attorney in San Diego got it in her head that she's going to test this out. So she arrests 33 African American men about 2 years ago, including Aaron Harvey and Brandon Duncan. Aaron Harvey at the time was in Las Vegas getting ready to study real estate and become a rich guy selling his real estate. And he hears all these helicopters and shit, and they land in the machine guns and SWAT, and he goes out and he says, "You guys making too much noise. You must have lost your guy by now. Whoever you're looking for is long gone." And then it turned out they were looking for him. And what am I charged with? And there's this whole series of violent and events in San Diego. You're charged with all this. He says, "I wasn't even in San Diego." We know you weren't in San Diego, but you're a documented gang member, and a gang carried it out. And we're going to put you in jail, and we're charging you with all of these things. Does it include murder?
Not on that case, just shootings.
Shootings. In jail for 7 months. They know perfectly well he had nothing to do with it and didn't even know about it. And he says, "Well, what do I get out of it? And why me?" He says, "Because your reputation went up with these, with this violence or whatever, your street cred or whatever." And he's not even living in San Diego. So I don't know why they wanted to mess with him, because his family came together and they joined forces with the Pillars of the Community and Reclaiming the Community, another project which is broader than Pillars in San Diego, and did not just let him be stuck in jail, because what most people do, they do not have legal resources and they make a plea bargain because they're facing 50 years in prison. And they say, "Well, you just say you're guilty and we'll give you 8 or whatever it is."
So they admit to something that they
People
did not do.
actually
Yeah.
admit because they're terrified.
There was one young man who was 19 years old. He signed it. He was same exact case as Aaron's. 33 cases, all a little complicated. He was documented off of Facebook photos. He signed a 20-year deal. So he's serving 20 years right now on the case. Because he was 19.
And he didn't have connections. So between the family, community, and their own good sense, they didn't sign a deal, and they spent 7 months in jail, being shackled, being handcuffed, going back and forth, to jury cases and so forth, and finally being freed. But as a consequence of that, there is a pretty decent movement in San Diego now addressing these police activities. So Pillars of the Community is involved in that. They also do things like workshops. What are your rights if you get stopped? What can you do? What should you not do? What you don't have to do? And all of that, and what the consequences are. And 2 years ago, my son, the Muslim, came up with the idea to do a rap CD, because he's of the brand that doesn't even listen to music, let alone rap. And they have connections with so many relationships with so many community folks that they got a major rappers from San Diego to put together a rap album that was a meaningful rap album to speak to the people in the streets who like listening to rap. Now, when I put it on, it's still rap and it's kind of hard to listen to, but it's a community activity. So then where I'm involved wasn't the rap album or that stuff, or the sound technician or anything, but another program we started last summer was just getting people together to write their story, any aspect of their own story that they want to do, but make it a story, not your whole long life. And then the goal of doing that would be we would invite your family and some friends, small gathering. We weren't looking at 500 people, didn't want that, and friends, and you would read it to them. And we've done that 3 different times with 3 different groups. And it is an amazing process to go through, absolutely amazing, because these people, we didn't ask them to, but they all found sometimes their most traumatic incident in their life, and sometimes their most, a moment of achievement and then awareness of where they had been. And so coincidentally, not exactly on purpose, it's all people of color, more or less. I mean, it's all African American, it's Chicano, and we work together. Everybody worked together. And you have to trust because you're trying to write and you read it to somebody else and somebody else tells you what they think, and maybe you can, make this a letter, it'll work. And so there are all kinds of stories. Some of them are neglect. Some of them are seeing your mother murdered in front of you. Well, one of them is that. Some is being bused to another school system and what that does to your morale. If you get bused to like a white school, education things. One was an incredible education achievement. The guy had background in prison and breaking the law and all kinds of stuff. Aaron Harvey, one of the important people who, important in that he's gone so public and brought the issue public for the San Diego 33, wrote a story about visiting his uncle in jail and then going with his mother, and then the second part of the story, it's him who's in jail. And pretty much the same scenario. People with some serious prison experiences. I mean, I learned. I had to say, I don't know what it's like, to live in a family where your parents are drug addicts. And what did that look like? What was it like when you guys came home? So I learned so much. And at the same time, these are people who are thriving and struggling to thrive. I mean, they're struggling with life now. It's not easy. Coincidentally, at least half of them are related to City College in one way or another. I have a Palestinian colleague who was actually helped start that program, and she just gave a story about how, well, if you people say, where are you from? She says, I'm from Detroit. No, where are you really from?
Right.
And then how she's gotten stereotyped and sort of branded, and how that's an issue for folks, how to identify yourself and what the reactions are. So it's a wide variety. So these people read their stories, and that was very successful. And then we've gotten the opportunity, because here we have a press called CityWorks Press, and it's an independent press, and now those stories are going to get published.
Right.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
And Erica, I'm not sure if she's going to get it in on time because we have to get it today, said she would write a blurb. Big Man wrote a wonderful blurb about it and how important it is to get these stories out. And I don't know if you know Jimmy Santiago Baca or Luis Rodriguez. Both of them, they're very important Chicano writers, and one of them had experience with gangs, the other one a lot of experience with prisons and stuff, and that's what they wrote about. And, we teach them a lot in our classes. And so it's really an exciting project. We're going to pick it up again. and see where it goes. Yeah, so it's modest, but altogether we included everybody who wanted to be included in the publishing part. We included everybody, 19 authors.
So there's one very explicit connection there. You're talking about the blurbs with the Black Panther Party, but can you tell me about, have there been other opportunities for bringing in lessons of your own experience, the Black Panther Party, to the work that's going on in San Diego now?
You know, I've gone to classes, pretty much. I've gone to classes, and then last year, and I've talked to classes and given presentations. I'm being asked to be involved in a panel at San Diego State. I've spoken twice at UCSD, and it was usually at times when there was organization going on. Once shortly after there were some awful incidents in UCSD. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but there was like, I don't know, effigies of like, not effigy, Ku Klux Klan, but very threatening kinds of stuff. Do you remember what it?
Well, first it started with the Compton cookout. That picture.
Yeah, they had this
And then
so-called
there
Compton
was
cookout.
nooses
Nooses
on the
on the campus, yeah. And then graffiti, anti-black graffiti. So I've spoken at UCSD a few times, and I have those things coming up. When Big Man came down, I presented him and spoke to those. And that's pretty much the extent. I'm not a star. I just happen to be in a lot of places.
Sorry, let's just see Alexandra White just gave this huge, amazing thing about us.
No, I'm not a star. I've just been in some places. I've done things in my life where I didn't know what the risks were. Always. I was in the Panthers for a year, a serious year. And I met some people who I respect very, very much. But I did not establish the ongoing relationships, particularly with women. Part of the problem with the Panthers, one of the problems, we didn't take care of ourselves, and you're going to hear this from Erica Huggins. We did not take care of ourselves. We were just running all the time, and some of that included personal relations. And I'm talking only about my year, 1969, in Oakland headquarters. I cannot speak for what was going on every place else and later.
So how did that manifest when you said not taking care of yourselves?
Well, part of what I was thinking about is not taking care of ourselves is, for me anyway, having good relationships with other women in the party. There just wasn't any time. You're just running around all the time. Or you go home and sleep. If you had your own home, or you'd sleep there. We were always doing something. So, for example, I don't think I spoke to anybody else about the sexual harassment. Now, that seems a little silly. That it shouldn't have been that way.
What about the stress or mental health repercussions of being in a high stress life situation?
I never thought about it. I think my way to deal with high stress is to forget. Like the details, I think my highest stress was actually third college, believe it or not. And I've forgotten the details. I've forgotten. I can just tell you, Carlos Blanco and his entire family tells me that I was threatened by guns. I would not have said. I would say somebody was intimidating me and I left, but I didn't remember the guns, and everybody else did. So it's kind of like, there's an emotional toll, but I think I just sort of suppressed that emotional toll and keep on keeping on. There's an emotional toll also. I always said, oh, well, those people who say, I had a teacher in high school, and he said it was some stupid class, like, I don't know, social adjustment or something. This was a light-skinned black guy. He wore some kind of toupee, and it looked like shoe polish to us on the back of his head. And one day he said, the kids who are worst adjusted are the ones who are born out of wedlock. Well, for sure I was born out of wedlock because it was illegal to be married, and mixed race. And I said, oh, he's crazy because I have the advantage of being both. And the born out of wedlock, well, that never gave me trouble. But being mixed race in a time of identity politics is a problem. And I have to be really honest. I got a lot of Jewish in me. I was very close to my grandmother. You know, I walk through the world as African American. I'm fine with that. My grandmother even would ask me, I said, I got a boyfriend. She would say, is he Jewish? You know, it's just there. So when we're talking about Israel and Palestine, yes, I agree. And my grandmother was very upset with Israeli policies regarding Palestine. Very upset. And she would be in arguments with all her Jewish old lady friends all the time about that. But then I don't want to hear anything that sounds a little bit like anti-Semitic, you know. Even though I might even be getting kidded like by my Muslim grandkids or whatever, you know. No, what are you talking? You got to understand the history of the Jews. And yes, what large aspects of the government is doing now is really bad. But don't forget, there's people in Israel who don't agree. And they have to be pretty brave if they're fighting against this mainstream. So I'm always navigating that. I do not like to go to anything that's strictly racial based. I don't go to the African American faculty staff meetings, so kind of over that. And I don't go to the 100% Chicano things. And I'm always invited. I'm always invited to those things. And it's probably stupid of me not to go. But I don't want to go to anything that's so racially based. And that's just, you know, I think that's not the part of it. You know, the Panthers, what was interesting about the Panthers is they did reach out to other groups. It wasn't, yes, we want to be a black group, but we want to reach out to other groups, not, you know, attack them and fight over the crumbs. And I think that's very important. And they did do that. And, you know, once in a while, nationalism would come in. But there's reasons for black people to have a chip on their shoulder. You know, it's have to discuss why that's there. If chip on the shoulder is the right expression, it's not.
Wonderful. Well,
I think I got most of it.
I feel like we could talk for hours more and would love to do that, but we should probably start to wrap up. Is there anything that you thought I was going to ask that I didn't ask that I should have asked today in the conversation?
I'll think of that tonight for sure. We covered a lot of territory. I would just like to add that my sister also has pretty much dedicated her life to healthcare, the African American community, and has organized a lot of things. My brother, because she became a medical doctor, and neither of our parents had gone to college. My brother became, he actually suffered the most in the McCarthy period, because the FBI even came and visited him in San Luis Obispo when he was in college and everything. So he kind of stayed away from that activist kind of thing, but he became the CEO the chief medical officer of Kaiser, of a whole section of Kaiser in Los Angeles. And I think he actually changed the culture of the hospital. At least that's how people talked. And they talked. He says, when Dr. Halig, because he had a relationship with the staff, with the custodians, with the nurses, and the doctors, and okay, you know. But they says, when Dr. Alexander first came, we used to talk amongst ourselves, and we'd say, is he a brother or what? And then they figured it out, you know, that yes, he is. He was. And, you know, in his heart above all, you know, and in his allegiances and who he thought was important. Yeah. And that's the legacy of the family. And my other regret is that I interviewed my aunt, I interviewed my brother, I interviewed my sister. This is after my father's death and after my mother's death. And I interviewed some cousins, but I never interviewed my mother. And that was a big mistake. Because I think she was the solid rock behind that whole operation, holding that family together, going to a holiness church in Paris, California. She had to go too, you know, with my uncle and aunt. And how did she do it?
What a life. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. You've carried her
It's
with
that-
you, though.
Yeah, it's that quiet part, that quiet strength that she had. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much.
My
Thank you
pleasure.
for everything you've done, and obviously, but also for spending time with us today and telling this incredibly important story.
Thank you.
Fascinating story.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I want to pick your brains about what to do with all my
Okay.
stuff.
Yes.
I got more.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture.